Jakob Weiss stood inside his cabin, peering through a slim opening in the shutters as three figures struggled past in the blizzard. They were hunched over, battling a wind that whipped snow across the mountain valley in a horizontal sheet. They were clearly hunting for his wood supply, convinced he must have stashed it somewhere nearby. Their reasoning was simple. No one could possibly stay warm for 6 straight days during a storm like this without having a readily accessible fuel source. He watched as they finally gave up, disappearing back into the whiteout toward their own cabins, where their fires were dwindling and their wood was buried under several feet of snow. Jakob turned away from the window, opened the trapdoor in his cabin floor, and climbed down into the chamber below. He emerged with another armful of bone-dry firewood, a supply those men would never even dream existed. Before we get into the details of how Jakob built something that revolutionized winter survival all across the Rocky Mountains, let us know where you're watching from. And if you're captivated by stories of frontier innovation and survival ingenuity, be sure to hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's story is even more incredible than this one. Jakob Weiss sensed something was terribly wrong the instant he noticed the cabin door standing wide open. Snow had drifted halfway across the threshold, the white powder spilling onto the dirt floor like an unwelcome intruder forcing its way inside. He'd been out since dawn, checking his trap lines along the creek, and Thomas Ricks should have been here. Thomas should have kept the fire burning, should have kept the door shut tight against the January cold. Jacob dropped the 3 frozen beaver pelts he'd been carrying and stepped into the cabin. The fire was dead, nothing but gray ash and a few charred pieces of wood that had burned down to nothing hours earlier. Thomas's rifle was propped up in the corner, his coat hung on its peg, but his boots were missing. The realization slammed into Jacob with the force of a physical blow. Thomas had gone outside without his coat on, in the dead of a Wyoming mountain winter. That spelled panic, desperation, and a situation gone horribly wrong. Jakob grabbed his own rifle and headed back out into the storm. The wind had picked up considerably since morning, driving snow so thick that he could barely see 20 feet ahead. He followed the only visible tracks, boot prints already half filled with fresh powder, leading away from the cabin toward the treeline, where they kept their woodpiles stacked for easy access. He found Thomas Hendricks 30 yards from the cabin, lying face down in snow that had drifted around his body like a burial shroud. In his right hand, Thomas still clutched an empty canvas sack, the kind they typically used for hauling firewood. Jakob knelt beside his partner and knew, without even checking, that Thomas was dead. The body was frozen solid, as hard as the ground beneath the snow. Jakob forced himself to assess the scene with the keen eye of a trapper, reading the story etched in the disturbed snow and the final, desperate actions. Thomas had burned through their indoor wood supply. Instead of carefully rationing what remained, he'd let the fire burn hot and fast, probably figuring the storm would break soon. When the fire died and the cabin temperature plummeted, Thomas had panicked. He'd rushed outside without proper clothing, thinking speed was more crucial than preparation. He'd made it to the woodpile. Jakob could see where Thomas had tried to load the sack, scattered pieces of split pine in the snow. But the cold had overtaken him quickly. Fingers went numb. Thinking became muddled. The cabin was only 30 yards away, but in the blinding whiteout conditions, 30 yards might as well have been 30 miles. Thomas had become disoriented, walked in the wrong direction, collapsed, and died alone in the storm, while warmth and shelter waited just beyond his failing vision. Jakob hauled Thomas's body back to the cabin, dragging him through snow that resisted every step. He laid his partner on the floor and sat beside him as the wind howled outside and the temperature inside plummeted toward freezing. They had firewood outside, stacked and ready, enough to last the winter. But Thomas had died trying to reach it. The problem wasn't a lack of resources. The problem was access. When storms turned violent, when visibility dropped to 0, when the cold could kill in minutes, having firewood 30 yards away was the same as having no firewood at all. Jakob stared at the cabin walls, at the simple door, at the single room that represented what most mountain men considered adequate shelter. Thomas Ricks had been capable and experienced. He died because traditional cabin design assumed you could always step outside when needed. That assumption had just killed Jacob's partner. Jacob would bury Thomas when the storm broke, but first, he would survive this night. And then, he would figure out how to build shelter that never required a man to risk his life in a storm. Spring arrived in the Wind River Range in late April of 1842, melting snow and revealing what winter had claimed. Jacob Weiss traveled down from the mountains to Meg Coulter's trading post at Valley Junction, carrying his season's furs and the heavy weight of Thomas Hendrick's death still weighing on his mind. The trading post was a low-log structure that served as a supply depot, a meeting place, and an informal headquarters for trappers working the surrounding territory. Meg ran it alone since her husband's death 2 years prior, managing inventory and credit with sharp efficiency. Jacob was securing his furs when he overheard Red Sam Loud's distinctive voice from inside. The old Scotsman was holding court with trappers who had survived the winter, and his words stopped Jacob in his tracks. The Larson brothers didn't make it. Eric and Niels. Both found them in their cabin up Sheep Creek Way, froze to death after their wood ran out. Jacob entered the trading post. 6 men stood around the pot-bellied stove, their faces reflecting the wear of a hard winter. "How many?" Jacob asked quietly. Red Sam turned. "German. Heard about Thomas. Sorry for your loss."
He paused.
"4 dead that we know of. Thomas, the Larsons, and a new man named Cooper. Another 5 abandoned their claims midwinter rather than face another storm. Antoine Brossard, a French-Canadian voyageur with a scar across his cheek, shook his head. Worst winter in 20 years. You go outside in those storms, you die. You stay inside without wood, you freeze. That's mountain life, Red Sam said with the finality of a man who'd seen 23 winters. Men die. You accept it or you leave. The other trappers nodded. This was established wisdom, the accepted cost of living in the high country. Winter claimed lives the way it claimed everything else that wasn't strong enough. Jacob said nothing, but his silence felt different from acceptance. Meg noticed. She'd been tallying his furs at the counter, watching him with the attention of someone who recognized when a man was thinking rather than just listening. After the others left, she approached him. "You've got that look, Jacob. Thomas used to complain about it. Said you'd get an idea in your head and chew on it like a dog with a bone. What if we didn't store wood outside at all?" Jacob said. Meg tilted her head. "Where else would you store it?" "Under the cabin, in a chamber built into the foundation. You'd load it from outside when the weather permitted, but access it from inside. The wood would be protected, dry, and you'd never have to leave shelter to reach it." Red Sam, who was examining traps near the door, laughed. "You planning to live in a mine shaft, German?" Jacob ignored him. He pulled charcoal from his pocket and began sketching on the wooden counter. Lines became walls. Walls became structure. Structure became something none of them had ever seen before. "How much would the iron hardware cost?" Jacob asked. Meg studied the sketch. She'd seen enough desperate ideas from mountain men to recognize the difference between fantasy and something that might actually work.
"More than you made this season," she said.
"But I'll extend you credit. You build this, and it works. I want to know about it." Jacob nodded. That was all he needed. Late spring of 1842 found Jacob Weiss standing on a slight rise 2 miles from where Thomas had died, carefully studying the terrain with the same meticulous attention his father had taught him decades ago in Bavaria. Johann Weiss had been a stonemason, and he'd drilled into young Jacob that a structure's strength came from what you built below ground, not above it. Jacob had selected this spot for very specific reasons. The elevation provided natural drainage, ensuring that snowmelt and rain would flow away rather than pool around the foundation. A rocky outcrop to the northwest would help break the force of prevailing winter winds. Dense pine growth on 3 sides offered additional wind protection while still allowing for ample southern sun exposure. He drove stakes into the ground, marking an 8 by 12-foot rectangle. Most trappers would start cutting logs at this point, racing to complete a cabin before the weather turned harsh. Jacob sat down with charcoal and paper, sketching plans that drew on vivid memories of his father's voice and lessons. The innovation forming in Jacob's mind was radical by frontier standards. Instead of simply building a cabin on the ground, he would build it over a hollow space. The cabin would rest on stone walls that enclosed an underground chamber. That chamber would serve as a storage area for firewood, accessible from both the outside and the inside through separate doors. The engineering challenge was significant. How deep should he dig? 6 feet would put the floor below the frost line while still keeping it above the bedrock. How would he support the cabin's weight over a hollow space? Stone walls on 3 sides, with the cabin's own foundation logs forming the 4th wall. Heavy timber beams would span the chamber width, supporting floor planks that would become the chamber's ceiling. Access would require 2 openings. A trapdoor in the cabin floor would provide interior access via a ladder. An external loading door built into the foundation would allow him to throw wood into the chamber from the outside. The system would separate loading from retrieval, allowing him to load in bulk during good weather and retrieve what he needed from inside during storms. Jakob worked through the potential problems on paper. Water drainage required a sloped floor leading to the external door. Ventilation needed a shaft to prevent suffocation and moisture buildup. The external door required protection from snow accumulation. Every detail mattered because failure underground could mean burial or a structural collapse. Peter Dunham, a young trapper working a claim 3 miles away, rode up as Jakob was sketching beam placements. Peter was 26 and in only his 2nd year in the mountains, still enthusiastic where older trappers had become more resigned. "Most men just stack logs and call it done," Peter said, looking at the detailed drawings. "Most men freeze when storms come," Jakob replied without looking up. Peter studied the sketches. "You're serious about building down before you build up. My father built foundations that held churches for 200 years. I'm building one that needs to hold for 20 winters. You'll need help with the heavy beams." Jakob looked up. "You offering?" "I watched Thomas freeze last winter. I'd rather not do the same." Peter dismounted. "When do we start?" Jakob handed him a shovel.
"Now."
They broke ground that afternoon, driving the first shovel into the earth that would become Jakob's underground chamber. The work ahead would take months, but Jakob had learned that speed killed men like Thomas. Careful planning and patient construction kept them alive. The hole they were digging represented more than just shelter. It represented the difference between accepting death as inevitable and engineering survival right into the very foundation itself. The summer of 1842 brought long days and the backbreaking work of excavation. Jakob and Peter removed earth 1 shovelful at a time, digging a rectangular pit 8 feet wide, 10 feet long, and 6 feet deep. The work was monotonous and exhausting. Lift, throw, repeat. 40 cubic yards of dirt and rock moved by hand over 2 weeks. Jakob's perfectionism frustrated Peter. Every wall had to be perfectly vertical, checked constantly with a plumb line Jacob had fashioned from cord and a stone weight. The floor had to be perfectly level except for a slight slope toward where the external door would be. "It's just a hole, Jakob," Peter said on the 5th day, wiping sweat from his face. "Close enough is good enough." "Close enough gets you killed when the ceiling collapses under the cabin's weight," Jakob replied, checking the north wall's angle for the 3rd time that hour. Peter learned to stop arguing and start watching. He began to see what Jakob saw, that precision in excavation meant stability and structure, that every measurement mattered because this hole would support tons of weight. When the excavation was finished, the stone gathering began. Jakob needed flat stones for the walls, hundreds of them. The nearest source was a creek bed 2 miles away, where the water had smoothed and fractured stones into usable pieces. They spent 3 weeks hauling stones. Each stone was carefully evaluated before transport. Jakob rejected rounded stones, stones with cracks, stones that were too thick or too thin. He wanted pieces roughly rectangular, 12 to 18 inches across, flat enough to stack with minimal gaps. Peter carried stones in a canvas sack. Jakob carried them in a leather harness he designed that distributed weight across his back and chest. They made 4 trips daily, returning with 30 to 40 stones each trip. The pile beside the excavation grew slowly. Antoine Brossard visited during the 3rd week. The French-Canadian trapper stood at the edge of the pit, looking at the stone pile, then at Jakob and Peter's dirt-covered clothes. "Building a palace for rats. German?" Antoine said, grinning. Jakob was fitting stones together on the ground, testing which pieces would work best beside each other. "Building something that works," he said without looking up. Antoine watched for a few minutes, shook his head, and rode off. Peter noticed he looked back twice before disappearing into the trees. Wall construction began in early July. Jacob used dry stacking, fitting stones together without mortar. Each stone was placed to interlock with those around it, creating structural strength through weight and friction. Between stones, Jacob packed his clay, horsehair, and resin mixture, filling gaps and creating a seal against moisture. The mixture itself took 3 days to prepare. Jacob dug clay from a riverbank, collected horsehair from a wild horse carcass, and boiled pine resin for hours. He mixed these ingredients in precise proportions, working the mixture until it reached the consistency he wanted. Peter learned to pack it between stones, pressing it deep into the gaps, smoothing the surface. The walls rose slowly, 6 inches per day being good progress. By late July, the walls stood 6 feet tall on 3 sides of the chamber, with the 4th side left open, where the cabin's foundation logs would eventually form the interior wall. Late summer of 1842 brought Jacob's biggest engineering challenge, building a ceiling strong enough to support an entire cabin over a hollow chamber. This was where theory would meet reality, where his father's stonemason principles would either prove sound or fail catastrophically. Jacob needed timber beams, but not just any logs. He spent 4 days searching the surrounding forest for trees with very specific characteristics: straight grain, minimal taper, approximately 12 inches in diameter, and no rot or insect damage. He found 6 suitable pines and felled them carefully, cutting 12-foot lengths that would span the 8-foot chamber width with 2 feet of overlap on each side for support. Peter helped drag the beams to the construction site, using a horse Jacob had borrowed from Meg Coulter. Each beam weighed roughly 300 pounds. Moving them required leverage, rope, and patience. The beams had to rest securely on the stone walls. Jacob notched the top course of stones on opposite walls, creating pockets that would cradle each beam and prevent lateral movement. He spaced the beams 3 feet apart, giving him 4 beams total spanning the chamber. "What if the cabin falls into the hole?" Peter asked as they positioned the first beam. Jacob had asked himself the same question. His answer came from understanding load distribution. Weight spreads across multiple beams. Each beam transfers the load to the stone walls. The stone walls transfer it to the earth. As long as the beams don't span too far and the walls are solid, the structure holds. "You sound certain." "I am. My father built cathedral foundations using these principles."
Cathedrals are still standing.
They tested the first beam by loading it with stones, piling weight in the center until they'd added roughly 500 pounds. The beam sagged slightly, but held. Jacob examined the notch supports, checked for cracking, and found none. He nodded, and they continued. By early August, all 4 beams were positioned and secured. Across these beams, Jacob laid split planks perpendicular to the beam direction. The planks were 3 inches thick, fitted tightly together, and pegged to the beams with wooden dowels Jacob had whittled during the evening hours. Over the planks went a layer of birch bark for waterproofing. Over the bark, Jacob spread his clay mixture in a 1/2-inch layer, sealing every gap. The result was a composite ceiling: timber for strength, bark for a moisture barrier, clay for insulation and additional sealing. Before building the cabin walls on top, Jacob insisted on a final test. He and Peter both climbed onto the completed ceiling and jumped, testing its ability to handle dynamic loads. The structure didn't flex, didn't crack, and didn't show any sign of weakness. Red Sam Loud arrived that afternoon, drawn by curiosity about what the German had been building all summer. He examined the chamber, the stone walls, and the ceiling structure. He walked around the perimeter twice, then stood at the edge, looking down into the space. "It's sound work, German," Sam said finally. "Still think you're crazy, but it's sound." Jacob accepted the compliment without comment. Validation from a man with 23 winters of experience meant the engineering was solid. Now came the next phase: cutting the access opening and beginning cabin construction. Early autumn of 1842 brought the critical phase, building the access points that would make Jacob's chamber functional. The cabin structure stood complete above the chamber, its walls rising solid and tight. Now, Jakob focused on the doors that would connect the outside to the chamber and the chamber to the inside. The external loading door demanded Jakob's perfectionism. This door would face weather, wildlife, and the test of time. He selected planks from the densest pine he could find, cutting them to 3 inches thick. Each plank was shaped with his draw knife until the surfaces were smooth and the edges were perfectly straight. He fitted the planks together using tongue-and-groove joinery, each board interlocking with the next. When assembled, they formed a door 30 inches wide and 40 inches tall, thick enough to stop a bear and heavy enough to require 2 men to lift. Peter watched Jacob spend an entire week on this single door. "You could have built 2 cabins by now," Peter said, not complaining but genuinely amazed at the time investment. "2 cabins a bear could break into," Jacob replied, planing a plank edge for the 4th time. "I'm building one it can't." The door's interior face received diagonal iron brackets forming an X pattern. Jacob had purchased these from Meg on credit, expensive frontier iron that cost more than a month's worth of pelts. He bolted the brackets through the planks using square-cut nails that were clenched over on the exterior side. The hinges were mortised into both the door and the foundation logs. Jacob cut rectangular pockets in the wood deep enough that the hinges sat flush. Then he bolted them through with iron pins. To remove these hinges, someone would have to destroy the logs themselves. The door couldn't be torn off, only broken through. A heavy wooden beam served as the locking mechanism. Jacob mounted iron brackets to the stone walls inside the chamber. The beam slid through these brackets and engaged with a mortise cut into the adjacent wall. When locked, the beam connected the door directly to the stone structure. The internal trapdoor received equal attention. Jacob built it into the cabin floor near the back wall, a 3-foot square opening with the same thick plank construction, but this door opened downward into the chamber, hinged on one edge, so it would swing down and rest against the interior wall when open. A rope handle recessed into the trapdoor's surface allowed it to be pulled closed from below. From above, the door sat flush with the floor, disguised under a bearskin rug that made it invisible to casual observation. Jacob constructed a wooden ladder and mounted it permanently to the chamber's interior wall. 6 feet tall with rungs spaced 12 inches apart, it provided easy access between the cabin and the chamber. The final element was a protective canopy above the external door. Jacob extended the roof logs 2 feet past the foundation, creating an overhang that would deflect snow away from the loading entrance. Testing came next. Jacob and Peter simulated a forced entry, pushing and prying against both doors. Everything held. Jacob threw split firewood through the external door, then entered the cabin, opened the trapdoor, descended, and retrieved the wood. The system worked exactly as designed. Late November of 1842 brought the test Jacob had been preparing for since Thomas died. He'd spent October splitting and stacking firewood, storing 150 pieces in the underground chamber and maintaining an external pile as well. The redundancy was intentional. If the system failed, he wanted backup options. The storm announced itself 3 days in advance. The temperature dropped sharply. The wind shifted to the northwest. Animals moved to shelter with an urgency born of an instinct older than human memory. Jacob recognized these signs from 11 winters in the mountains. He spent the day before the storm's arrival loading the chamber completely, throwing split pine through the external door, listening to each piece clatter onto the stone floor below. When finished, he secured the external door from inside the chamber, sliding the heavy beam lock into place, then climbed the ladder and closed the trapdoor above him. The storm arrived at dawn. Wind-driven snow reduced visibility to 0 within hours. Jacob kept his fire burning steadily, watching through a narrow gap in the shutters as the world outside dissolved into white chaos. The psychological challenge was harder than he'd anticipated. Every instinct urged him to check the external woodpile, to verify supplies, to do something active. Sitting inside while the snow piled higher and higher felt wrong, despite knowing the chamber held everything he needed. Day 2 tested his discipline. The fire consumed wood steadily. By afternoon, his indoor supply was depleted. This was the moment. Either the system worked, or he faced the same choice that had killed Thomas: brave the storm or freeze. Jakob moved the bearskin rug aside and opened the trapdoor. Cold air rose from the chamber below, but nothing like the deadly cold outside. He descended the ladder, his boots finding the rungs with practiced ease. The chamber was dark except for the light from the open trapdoor above. He gathered an armload of wood, climbed back up, and closed the trapdoor. The entire process took 30 seconds. He was breathing slightly harder from the climb, but was otherwise unchanged. No exposure to wind, no snow, no risk. The relief was profound. It worked exactly as designed. The storm's intensity increased on day 3. Through the shutter gap, Jakob saw shapes moving past his cabin, 3 men bent against the wind that hurled snow horizontally. He recognized their builds: Red Sam, Antoine, and another trapper named Morrison. They were searching the area around his cabin, looking for his woodpile. Jakob understood immediately. They'd seen smoke rising from his chimney for 3 days straight. They knew he was. He could hear them chopping and breaking burning wood, but they were unable to locate his private wood supply. They were convinced that he must have an external woodpile stashed somewhere accessible, despite the ferocity of the storm. He watched as they circled his cabin not once, but twice, before finally giving up their search. What they failed to do was inspect the foundation of the cabin. The dark opening situated beneath the protective overhang simply appeared to be a trick of the light and shadow. The secret remained undiscovered. When the storm finally subsided on the 4th day, Jakob ventured outside to find that his external woodpile was buried under a staggering 4 feet of snow. Retrieving it would have required hours of arduous digging, but luckily for him, his fire had never even faltered because his actual supply of wood was safely stored underground, completely protected from the elements, and easily accessible without him ever having to step foot outside. The December of 1842 brought with it a different kind of confirmation that his system was working. Jakob was returning from checking his trap lines on a particularly cold afternoon when he noticed fresh tracks in the snow surrounding his cabin. Large paw prints, each one considerably bigger than his own hand, were spread wide across the snow-covered ground. A grizzly bear, which he could tell was male based on the sheer size of the prints, had paid him a visit while he was away. Jakob diligently followed the tracks, carefully reading the story that they told. The bear had approached from the east, circled the cabin a couple of times, and then proceeded to test various points of entry. Deep claw marks were clearly visible, scarring the main cabin door where the animal had pushed and scratched relentlessly. More marks were found around the corners of the cabin where the logs met, but the most concerning evidence of the bear's visit was at the external loading door. The bear had, in fact, discovered the entrance to the foundation. The snow around the entrance was noticeably disturbed from sustained attention. Claw marks gouged the thick planks of the door, long scratches that suggested a considerable amount of force had been applied. Jakob knelt down beside the door, examining the damage with growing concern. The planks showed some surface scoring from the bear's claws, but there was no structural compromise to the integrity of the door. The hinges remained secure, still mortised deep into the foundation logs. The door itself hadn't moved even slightly from its frame. The iron brackets that he had installed on the inside had effectively distributed the force across multiple points, preventing any single area from failing under the pressure. That night, Jakob was inside the cabin when he heard distinct sounds coming from outside. Heavy footfalls crunching in the snow, and the sound of breathing that was clearly not the wind. He quickly moved to the gun port, a narrow slit that he had built into the wall, which allowed him to observe the outside without exposing himself to danger. The grizzly had returned. In the bright moonlight, which reflected brilliantly off the fresh snow, Jakob could see the animal clearly. It was massive, probably weighing in at around 700 pounds. With the distinctive humped shoulders and the dish-shaped face of a mature male grizzly, the bear moved with a sense of purpose. It wasn't randomly exploring, but rather methodically testing each potential entry point. It approached the main door first, pushing against it with one massive paw. The door rattled slightly, but it held firm. The bear pushed even harder, throwing its entire weight forward against the door. Still nothing. It then began scratching at the door frame, attempting to widen any existing gaps or to find some kind of weakness in the structure. Jakob watched intently through the gun port. His rifle was loaded and ready, but he kept it lowered. He wanted to see if the structure of the cabin could effectively defend itself without him needing to intervene. The bear then moved to the external loading door. This particular door received the most attention from the persistent animal. For a good 15 minutes, Jakob watched as the animal worked tirelessly at the door with an intelligence that genuinely surprised him. It tried to get its claws under the edge of the door, attempting to pry it open. It bit at the corners where the door met the frame, trying to get a grip. It even reared up on its hind legs and came crashing down on the door with both front paws, a tremendous blow that would have shattered most standard constructions. The door absorbed the impact with a solid thud, but there was no give, no sign of weakness. The beam lock on the interior held firm, and the mortised hinges didn't budge even slightly. The iron brackets distributed the force exactly as they were designed to do. Eventually, the bear seemed to give up in frustration. It circled the cabin one more time, sniffing and testing every possible point of entry, then finally wandered back off into the darkness. Jakob lowered his rifle, never having needed to fire it. In the morning, Peter arrived to find Jakob closely examining the new claw marks on the external loading door. "You were inside while this was happening?" Peter asked as he reached out and touched the deep gouges in the wood. Jakob simply nodded. "The door did the fighting for me," he said. The spring and summer of 1843 brought about a significant transformation for Jakob, turning him from a solitary innovator into a reluctant teacher. Peter Dunham began construction on his own chamber system in May, and Jakob found himself supervising and advising someone else's build for the very first time. Peter's building site was located approximately 3 miles from Jakob's cabin, on similarly elevated terrain with good drainage. They began with the excavation, and Jacob observed Peter as he meticulously measured and remeasured the dimensions, displaying the same obsessive care that Jacob had demanded of himself. The real challenge arose when it came to materials. Peter had only been trapping for 2 seasons, and as such, he simply couldn't afford to purchase the expensive iron hardware that had made Jacob's doors nearly impenetrable. They stood together in me Coulter's trading post, discussing potential alternatives. "Wooden reinforcements," Jacob said finally, cross-bracing on the door interior. "Multiple wooden pins instead of iron brackets. It won't be as strong as iron," he admitted, "but the principles still work." Peter's chamber slowly took shape over the course of 6 weeks. Stone walls rose using the same proven techniques that Jakob had refined over time. The ceiling beams were carefully put in place, with close attention paid to the distribution of the load. The doors were built using the materials that were readily available rather than the ideal materials, but they were solid and functional nonetheless. Red Sam Loud unexpectedly appeared at Jakob's cabin in late June. The old Scotsman dismounted from his horse without even offering a greeting, walked directly to the chamber entrance, and stood there looking at it for a long moment. "Show me how you did the ceiling beams," Sam finally said. There was no apology for his earlier mockery, and no admission that Jacob had been right all along, but the request itself was acknowledgement enough. Jakob spent an entire afternoon walking Sam through every single aspect of the construction, from the excavation depth to the precise placement of the ventilation shaft. "You're just giving this information away for free?" Sam asked incredulously. "I'm keeping people alive," Jakob replied simply. "That's worth a whole lot more than pelts." Sam nodded slowly in understanding. "I'll start building in August," he said. "Ground's too frozen up my way right now." Word quickly spread throughout the scattered trapping community. By midsummer, Jakob had personally visited 4 different building sites, offering his advice and guidance on chamber construction. Each build was slightly different, based on the terrain, the available materials, and the skill level of the builder, but the core principles remained consistent across all of them. Chief Wiki of the Shosun arrived in early autumn, accompanied by 2 younger men. The chief had heard stories about the white trapper who built underground, and his curiosity had led him to come and see it for himself. Through a combination of hand signs and broken English, Jakob showed Washiki the inner workings of the chamber system. The chief examined everything with careful attention, then spoke through one of his companions who knew more English. My people store food underground for many generations, the companion translated. You learn what we always know. Earth protects what wind destroys. Wiki then shared some of the Shoshone's traditional